Hey friends, I'm Elena from the Tiny Pandora design team, and I love to work with polymer clay and resin, and I have some fun stuff to show you with that today. Also, make sure that you subscribe to our design team channel so that you can be notified and check out a new tutorial every week. All right, now we're going to get started. Today we'll be making a miniature potted orchid set in resin. Now I have this on kind of a sped up double speed so that you guys don't have to watch so much of the boring sculpting, but you'll feel free to watch it as many times as you like if you feel like it's going too fast. We're going to start with just the simple little pot. I'm going to use some turquoise granite Sculpey, and we're going to just roll it in a little cylinder shape. I have a little tiny mighty blade there that I'm going to use throughout this, and that is a cane bender that I'm using to hollow out the center of my pot. Once you've got it hollowed out a little bit, you want to kind of make it evenly thick, the walls of it. Now this pot is going to be filled with the air roots and the leaves, so you won't really be able to see all of it, but I like to try to make it kind of realistic anyhow. So once we get that hollowed out and evenly thick, we'll set it aside to be baked with the leaves and the stalk and the air roots, which will be the next items I'll be sculpting. I've been studying different kinds of orchids in preparation to make this video, and just because I really love orchids and I want to do a series of different flowers that associate with different astrological signs, and this will be the first in that series. So I'm going to start making a stalk here. As you can see, I'm using a dark green. The color of the leaves and stalks on orchids vary just about as wildly as the types of orchids you'll see. The sizes, the colors, the patterns on them, it's just endless and beautiful. This particular orchid that I'm making, it's going to have dark green stalk and dark green leaves. But you'll notice that I've blended in with my dark green a slightly lighter green. Again, it's Sculpey, and I'll list the shades that I used in the comments. So the reason that I'm shaping it kind of like a cane is because I'm trying to make it kind of realistic and similar to the orchids, the potted orchids that I have and that I have been studying. And they often curve off with several more blooms in a shape like that, in a cane shape. So that's why I made that initial stalk that way. I'm using a snakes and swirls tool on the tile with my clay so that I can make another, what'll basically be an air root. Air roots are the roots that kind of protrude up out of the pot. They look kind of squiggly and they just add interest and they make it a little bit more realistic. So I'm setting my pot and my largest stalk in the mold that I'll be using today, I'm using a considerably larger mold than I normally would and sculpting my main orchid a lot larger than I would normally sculpt them because I prefer to make things kind of micro miniature to where the entire thing fits into like a pendant sized mold that you would wear around your neck. However, that can be challenging for you to be able to see what I'm doing when I'm sculpting something that tiny. So I've included a photograph of the scale I usually work on of a finished piece at the end alongside the one that I'm creating right now so that you can see the difference in size and also that you can see that you can make them in any size that you'd like. If you want it to be more surreal and more cartoonish, you can make your flowers whatever size that you'd like. But I'm kind of trying to stay within a miniature but realistic version of them. So you'll see I'm sculpting leaves now. These leaves, I give them kind of a little tail so that they can be more easily affixed in the pot. It gives them something to hang on and kind of hook onto the pot. And then I kind of try to give them a curve, like a natural curve, when I lay them out to be baked. Just a personal preference of how I like to see them and how I feel like they look more like the orchids that I have, that I am using as the basis for this orchid I'm making. Each time that I've made these flowers, I've tried to add a few more realistic elements. The first one I made was more cartoonish, and then each time I've gotten a little bit more realistic, and eventually I'd like them to look like they're real, like they're real super tiny orchids set in resin. Okay, now you'll see I'm sculpting the petals. There are several petals that make up the classic orchid shape that most people associate with the orchid plant. And the front two, more paddle-shaped petals, are the only actual true petals on the bloom. The back three that form like a triangle shape are called sepal. And sepal are like fake petals. And their purpose is all part of the pollination process. But we won't get too into that right now. Just suffice to say that all of the ones that look like petals here, I'll be creating right now using a kind of a shade of purple, a fuchsia type purple here. And I'm creating the first triangular sepal, or you could call them petals if you like. They're mock petals. I'm trying to layer them realistically on here. And after I create these petals that are, like I said, in kind of a triangle shape in the background, I'll create the two front petals that have kind of a rounded, paddly shape. And this takes a little bit of time to get down. I'm just using like a sculpting tool. with kind of a soft tip, because I find that when I use anything more rigid, it ends up being so much more cleanup. Every time I use it, it seems like I have to scrape away a little bit of clay off of the side around them, and then I can avoid that by using the softer tool. I sculpt these on the tile and then bake them on the tile, and then use a blade to remove them from the tile. And then I will put the whole thing together. Right now, I know it looks like just a bunch of random components, but trust me, it will make sense soon. So now, as you can see, I'm sculpting. I know it's not super duper clear, but I'm sculpting the actual petals, the 2 front petals. And as I said, this is larger than I would normally make my orchids, so that hopefully you can get a little bit better view of it. Now that I have all of my petals and sepal sculpted, I'm getting started on creating the throat and lip, which on the plant that I'm basing this on are kind of an orange with pink, or orange and fuchsia. So I've created this blend here to make those components, and it is cadmium yellow and fuchsia. And it makes almost like a sunset, streaky sunset kind of hue. And now I'm creating the throat and lip portion of the orchid. I shape them just kind of gingerly, get a little piece, kind of flatten it out, and then give it a little pinch so it has a little bit of a curve, almost like when you make a taco with your tongue. And then I use a really small purling tool. I think that's what they're called. Pardon me for not knowing all of the names of the tools yet, but it's the tool that has the tiny ball at the end. So I use that to press them down into the center of the flower. I then create the column, and the column is the very heart or the center of the orchid. In this case, it is white. Again, this is based on a real orchid that I have, and that's the colors that I'm using, and that's the colors that naturally occur on it. So the white center that looks like kind of a little pearl is called the column. I'm now sculpting, just pressing little beads and buds of clay to make the little ball buds that are on the ends of some of the stems. And I'm also sculpting extra petals, and I'll be showing you what I do with the extra petals in this next segment coming up. So I now have represented here all of the components that I wanted to create. I'm going to put them in the oven, and then after those are baked, well, before they're baked, I'm going to make quite a bit more of everything. But you don't have to watch while I make the same things over and over. I'm going to bake them in the oven, then take them out, and this next segment is going to be me putting them all together. So as you can see, there are many more flowers and petals and stalks, stems, leaves, every part of the orchid, even extra pots. I made a little bit of everything so that I could choose the ones that I like the best scale-wise and shape-wise. Once I had them all out and was holding it up near the mold so that I could kind of make sure I'm working within the size that I have chosen. And I've added some air roots and the lower level of the smaller leaves. I'm just using super glue. It's really fast drying. I got it from the Dollar Tree, and it is just super good to work with for this project because it dries fast. And once you get things in place, it gets trickier and trickier if it doesn't dry fast. Now, no matter what I do, once I start trying to glue the flowers to the stems, there's so little for them to hang on. Everything is so small that that part can be difficult no matter how fast your glue dries. And you can see in the mold there, I've already cured a layer of UV resin. In this case, it is Magic Gloss. It's Lisa Pavelka. I've already cured a layer of it so that it's a base for the orchid to sit on. Sometimes I put it directly in the mold and then pour the resin over it and let the back and the front have a little bit of 3D effect. But in this case, I wanted the back to be flat. There will be a little bit of protrusion in the front, but on the back, it will be flat. So that I cured. It takes quite a while because this particular mold is pretty large, so I had to use a lot of Magic Gloss and cure it for a long time. I don't recommend touching the resin when you're trying to check if it's done. Just be patient and leave it under there for several minutes before you do anything with it. You will probably not be using such large quantities of UV resin. If you were making something like this, you probably would want to use a 2-part resin, something this large, in comparison to the pendant size, which doesn't hardly use very much and takes so long to cure. And normally a more ideal size to use UV resin like this, but again, making it larger so you guys can see everything. So as you can see, I'm putting together the first actual flowers, complete flowers, onto the little curved stems that will attach to the main stalk. So that's what I'm doing right here. Giving each one a little stem to hang on to, and that stem will then be attached to the stalk. And as you can see, I'm using those spare petals to cover up where the stem joins with the orchid on the back and give it some dimension so that it looks more like a realistic orchid plant and doesn't have a bunch of areas where you can see it's clearly glued on or joining with the stem. The first couple of these that I made, I just noticed that when I looked at it from the sides or the back through the clear resin, that I didn't quite like the effect it had without giving him those extra petals. I really like the fullness that you get when you cover up the stems where they meet with the orchid with the extra petals. okay. And again, just continuing, I'm going to add the main orchid to the top of the stalk, the tip, I should say. And then I'm going to start adding those smaller stalks coming off, smaller stems coming off the main stalk that already have orchids attached to them. This is the part where it gets tricky because, like I said, there is just not much surface area to join with the glue. And once they start getting all gluey, then they don't want to join to themselves because the glue doesn't want to join to more glue. So this part takes a moment and a little bit of patience. But it is also a really fun part of this project, just watching it all come together how you want it. So I'm adding more petals to the back and combining all my little extra components. I've now finished attaching that orchid pretty securely, and I'm adding the next one. I'm just sizing it up, and you'll be able to tell when you start doing this project. You'll be able to tell where they'll look the best, where they fit the best, where they stay securely on there. And also keep in mind that this will be set in resin. So although you want all the components to be attached before you put them in there, otherwise they will float around. That I experienced as well. I thought, oh, I can just sort of get them to stick together once they're in the resin before I cure it. No, it just looks like they're disconnected when you do like they're floating away from each other. But I digress. Once you have these attached, you're going to be setting them in resin. So you don't have to worry too much about the fragility of all of these little parts, all these really delicate stems and petals and all these little parts that you think, gosh, this is just going to break right off or it's going to fall apart. Nope. That's what setting it in resin is for. So it pretty much just solidifies the whole thing and just freezes it just how you made it. Keeps it from being vulnerable. And just showcases it for you. Now this piece is going to be for my aunt. And I will be putting a frame around it after I've photographed it and everything for this video. And then I'll be sending it off to her. But for now, we're going to just keep working on finishing up, getting all of the orchids attached. We're almost done now. We've got 3 out of the 4. You can tell I'm starting to get all gluey here. I'm trying to see where I can get this little guy to get on there. It's fun to have a challenge, though, I think. And very rewarding. Anyway, I love to see a project turn out just how I envisioned it. So I take my time. There was 90 minutes of video of me making this, which I sped up to make into about 30 minutes for you guys. So this project takes a little bit of time, but we'll also say that 90 minutes included me making lots and lots of components a couple of times over. Sometimes the sculpting of the petals and the sepal comes easy. And sometimes it's like you just can't get it the shape you want, so you have to keep on working at it. I think some days we have those lucky days where it's just our hands move the way we want them to without it, hardly any effort seemingly. And then you have those days where you're just like, boy, I can't get this thing to do what I want it to do. That's what I'm going through right now, trying to get this last flower to go ahead and stick to my plant. But I promise you it will happen. Also, I should mention I'm using just some regular tweezers from Sally's. Any tweezers you got will be a good friend to you when you are working with these little tiny pieces. I tried doing this without tweezers and it's dang near impossible. You always feel like you're going to break everything while you're trying to grab it. So the tweezers really help. All right. Now this is like the payoff right here. This is when we fit our whole potted orchid into our mold and lay it down. We're gently just adjusting it. And then I'm turning it around so that you can get a better look at the completed potted orchid. I'm really happy with how it turned out. And now I'm going to just layer on some more UV resin. Just start pouring it on. You're going to want to do your piece in a few different layers, just to make sure that it gets cured as thoroughly as possible. I'm using a tiny Pandora UV light, and gosh, I think I did about four layers with this resin on this piece. In fact, I used like a slightly tinted resin on the last layer, and you'll see when the piece is complete. Now I'm just using a torch to remove air bubbles. There's always going to be a few air bubbles in there. I think it adds interest, personally. And then I'm using, again, that same tool with a little tiny ball on the end to draw out some of the corner bubbles that are too deep to reach with the torch. I'm now putting it in the UV light, and I let that sucker just stay in there for a long time. Here we have the completed piece, and then the piece next to the tiny pendant size version of it. In the background there is actually the orchid that I used as the example. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll watch the rest of the videos for our design team. So subscribe to Tiny Pandora Design Team. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful day.